How do I read the Bible before I sit down to write my sermon? More often than not, on a Monday, I will read through all three passages set by the lectionary. I tend to stick to the lectionary because that ensures that I don't suddenly jump onto a hobby horse.
Before I start writing my sermon, I sit down and read the three Bible passages of the lectionary that are given for that week. I then go away and think about some of them.
I usually choose two readings for every service, and one of those is always the Gospel. So I begin by reading the Gospel, I go away and think about that for a little while, and then I come back and look at the Old Testament and the Epistle and decide which one of those I want to match with the Gospel.
When I've read the passages, if something immediately jumps out at me as a theme for the service, I will use that. But other times I have to go away and think about it, and there's no worry about that. I always start preparing a service a couple of weeks in advance.
Do I do further study on all of the passages on a particular passage? When I read the Bible, the passages on a second reading, by then I am fairly sure which of the three books I would want to stick to. And I will then stick to that book, be it Gospel, Old Testament or Epistle, and I will then do a bit background reading around that particular book and passage.
Once I've identified the passage which is going to control the sermon and the theme of this service, once I've realised what I want to say, the first thing that I do is I go away and choose the hymns. Someone once said to me that there are two sermons in every good service, one from the pulpit and one through the hymns. And sometimes some good hymns can actually give you another theological perspective on what you're wanting to say. After that, I take a big sheet of paper and I splurge down all my thoughts on what I might say, what points I might make, what questions I have, and any illustrations or quotations I might want to use. Not to use them all, but to be able to select from what I've got on the piece of paper.
Once I've chosen the passage that's going to control my sermon, I spend a bit more time, both prayerfully and also reflectively, trying to think about what the passage itself is saying to me. Once I am much more confident about what I think it is saying to me, that is when I spend a bit more time with the commentaries to understand what others say about that particular passage.
Once I've picked my theme, I will write my sermon. Because once I've written my sermon, I can then think of hymns that go with my sermon. I can work out what order I need to do it, what I'm going to want people to take away from my service.
Whilst I'm preparing, I always try and boil it down to one sentence that I would like the congregation to take away with them at the end of the service. One thing, one idea, one thought, one challenge maybe, that when they all walk back out and go off for their Sunday lunch, that should be in their head.
I seek to identify the original purpose of the passage because that more often than not leads me to the controlling theme for my sermon.
I always think to myself, what do I want the congregation to go away thinking? What do I want them questioning? I don't want them going into the coffee after the service talking about last night's football. I want them going into that talking about what they've just heard.
In terms of structuring the sermon, it can vary. But I like to start off with perhaps an illustration or an anecdote or a story perhaps, which is fairly ordinary, which roots and grounds the idea in people's ordinary life and experience. And then from there I tend to build 2, maybe 3 points that I want to expand from it.
I structure my sermon very much about what's going on. How can I use that context of what it is in today? Where's it happening? What's it happening? What can you take away from that? What do you need to learn? Can you go and take that into today's environment?
How do I structure the sermon to achieve the aim? That's the trickier bit. Because the first thing that I will always wrestle with is, what type of service is it am I going to be in? But if we put that to one side for a second, the structures of 60% of my sermons will always be around 3 points. Simply being, the 3 points are easier for people to remember, especially as within my sermon I will tend to go back to those points and remind them of those points.
I've got 2 pieces of advice for anyone that's just starting out preaching. Firstly, if you read something and you don't understand it, don't worry. There's plenty of help out there. You've always got people you can call on. And the second piece of advice is the piece of advice that was given to me when I started preaching. That is, remember that anybody can walk off the street into your service and they have to be able to understand what you're talking about.
If I had any advice to give to you, it would be, don't try and run before you can walk. Learn the rules of good sermon construction, good service construction, and practice that. Get good and confident at that first, because you can't really break the rules until you know the rules. Don't think you have to be too different too quickly. A good, well-constructed, solidly delivered service is always going to do the job.
My best advice to them would be, the course they have taken up is a course to proclaim the gospel to the people of God. Trust God. Start your sermon preparation by praying. Take time. Don't rush the preparation of a sermon. And the final bit I will say to them is, read through your sermon as many times as you can. Each time you read it through, you may find yourself rewriting a section of it. Do not be scared of that. And at the end, when you've finished your writing and you're ready to deliver, pray about it. Because at the end of the day, we are only there to enable God's people to hear the voice of God.